Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for those of you who are present. Thanks for those who are joining us online. My name is Johan Olstorm. I'm an assistant professor in political theory at the University of Amsterdam. Welcome to our roundtable tonight about the idea of domestic colonies. This roundtable is inspired by the 200 years ago start of one of the first Dutch colonies of benevolence, the one here at Veenhuizen. You see a very idyllic representation here of this colony based in Drenthe, an agrarian colony where people were placed against their will. It was one of the unfree colonies. I'll just show you a few more pictures by way of an introduction, but before I will give the floor to our distinguished speakers of today. Here's another picture from a slightly earlier agrarian colony in Frederiksoord, about 30 kilometers south of Veenhuizen. This was a free colony. You could see the architectural style was quite different. What we'll see is that there is a common set of ideas and a common model behind it. These colonies were designed and intended, set up by a set of private actors, the so-called Society of Benevolence, in the early 19th century, to solve the perceived major social problems, and specifically the problems surrounding poverty, idleness, vagrancy, that were present at that time, and also that were. This was also a time of crisis. You should imagine. At the start of the 19th century, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which at the time included the Netherlands plus Belgium, had just freed itself from the French Revolutionary Army under Napoleon, and the result of this was a land that was in crisis, also economically, a crisis further reinforced by a set of bad harvests. So there was a lot of poverty, a lot of people with too little to survive, and then an idea was put forth by the Society of Benevolence to start cultivating wastelands in not very lightly populated parts of the Netherlands, especially in Drenthe, but also in Belgium. And these colonies where people were supposed to cultivate those wastelands, but along the same way also cultivate themselves to become better citizens, to acquire those virtues that they that were seen as part and parcel of being a good citizen. What those virtues exactly are will be explained to us before very long. These agrarian colonies were segregated, planned models where people were placed in close confinement with each other. They came in free and unfree forms. Here's a list of them. You can see that it was only over a couple of years, over a space of 7 years, that these colonies were set up. And they lasted a tremendously long time. Most of them only closed in the 1920s or 1930s. The Belgian ones even continued until 1990. But along the way, these colonies also changed function a little. Despite starting all being set up by this Society of Benevolence, and despite being set up with a similar idea, a similar model in mind, a model developed in order to solve the perceived social problems by bringing indigent people, poor people, vagrants, beggars, and so on, to the countryside, where by cultivating the wastelands, they were supposed to cultivate a better country, becoming better citizens. This model, we shall see, was one pioneered here in the Netherlands, but widely emulated, widely followed, and transported to other parts, both within Europe and outside of Europe. And it was a large-scale program. So you can see here, even in just the first 30 years, over 65,000 orphans, veterans, destitute people, petty criminals were placed in these Dutch colonies. So the question we want to ask ourselves today, and we have a distinguished panel for us to help us think about this, is was there a common set of ideas, was there a common ideology behind these agrarian colonies? And I'm not just referring to the founder of these colonies, which is the person depicted there, Johannes van der Bosch, but to also look more generally, to look at these colonies from a wider perspective, from an international perspective as well, and to take seriously the idea that these were portrayed as colonies. So what would it mean to look at these colonies of benevolence as colonies, to treat them as colonies not outside of Europe, not overseas territories, but as domestic or home colonies? And the person who is terribly well placed to introduce these questions for us is sitting here on the stage. Her name is Barbara O'Neill. She's the author of Domestic Colonies, one of the prize-winning book on the subject, one of the inspirations also for the UNESCO World Heritage bid. And she's a professor of the University of British Columbia. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I want to begin with probably the most basic of questions, and that is, what is a colony? The Oxford English Dictionary provides the following definition: sending settlers to a foreign territory and establish control over it. And I think if you were to ask most people, that would be a pretty close definition of it. They would agree with that. But the question that we're asking really is, does a colony have to be foreign by definition? Well, based on my own research, the answer is that there were, of course, domestic colonies, and domestic in two senses of the word. Domestic in the sense that colonies would exist within the borders of the colonizing state for fellow citizens rather than overseas in foreign territories and over foreign peoples. And secondly, that it was part of a state's domestic social policies to solve social problems, even as it continued to be part of foreign imperial policies of states, and often simultaneously. So if we think about the etymological origin of colonies, it comes from the Latin word colonia, which means agrarian settlement, very closely linked to the word colonist, which means farmer, and colere, which means cultivation. So from its inception, colonies were closely linked to this agrarian thread, agrarian labor. And so colonization can be thought of the process of sending people from the metropolis or the mother city to cultivate land in order to become independent, basically. If you could not grow your own food, you would not remain independent. So if we look then at the beginning or the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, jumping ahead from the ancient world, what we see is the idea of foreign colonialism or settler colonialism as an ideology being turned inward. And we can define the ideology of domestic colonialism as follows. It's an ideology that justifies segregating the idle poor into colonies within one's own state, engage them in agrarian labor on so-called waste land or uncultivated land, in order to both improve themselves, which was the ethical justification, and the land, which was the economic justification, because you could make revenues or profits out of it. There are basically three principles then within domestic colonialism. The first is the principle of segregation, that is removing people from cities or their own homes or their own families and placing them somewhere else. Agrarian labor on wasteland within one's own country, and finally this idea of improvement was absolutely fundamental. So when we think about the colonialists that were justifying these colonies within Europe, they almost always have these economic and ethical justifications, and we almost always see these three principles, emphasized to a different degree, but almost always present. So what I want to do then is talk about three case studies. The first is the Netherlands and Belgium, the colonies of benevolence for the poor, with Johannes van den Bos being the domestic colonialist that is justifying these colonies. The second is the Colonie agricole for juvenile delinquents within France, and the great French democratic theorist Alexis de Tocqueville being one of the main proponents and defenders of these colonies. And then finally in Britain, also labor colonies for the idle poor, and I want to look at either end of the 19th century for this. The first, Jeremy Bentham, the great English utilitarian philosopher, who came up with a plan for domestic colonies. And then at the end of the century in the 1890s, William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, who also organized his entire social reform plan around domestic colonies. So let's begin, first of all, with what Johan began with, which is the colonies of benevolence. Johannes van den Bosch created these first large-scale colonies for the idle poor in Europe. It is a transnational form of colonialism in the sense that he first went to Java, where he developed a system that he thought, coming back to the Netherlands, he could apply to the poor here. And he writes about this in his 1818 discourse on the poor, where he recommended these colonies for within Drenthe, within Belgium, and so on. And of course, one of the colonies that you saw was this is Veenhuizen. This is the second of 3 very large buildings that would house, and is still there, and you can go visit if you haven't already. I recommend it. It's a very interesting site, and the landscape and so on, it's worth seeing in person. The second case study then is France and the labor colonies for juvenile delinquents. And here we have Alexis de Tocqueville along with his friend Gustave du Beaumont, who was sent to America on behalf of the French government to study the penal system or penitentiary system in America. And they came back and submitted a report in 1833. Now, while Tocqueville was there, he was also making notes for his opus Magnus, his Democracy in America, but this was what he was actually getting paid for. And in this report, he argues against the kind of overseas penal colonies that were characteristic of the French penal system at the time, particularly for youth. And instead, what he argued for was agricultural colonies. So he wrote a whole appendix at the end on these colonies, and within it, he refers to Van den Bosch, and he talks, he got this from the Congress Library where he read about this, and he said, this is what we should be doing. And just to give you a kind of example of this sort of, ethical and economic, very common sort of justifications, you can see what he says here of experience. If experience should answer expectation, a result would obtain favorable to the poor, and here it is, who would exchange misery for the comfort of a farmer, and to the society the resources of which would be increased without new sacrifices. So this economic, we're going to create revenues to offset the cost of the poor, but also the poor themselves will be better off because they'll have a better life. So, and this is the colony that was built there. Maitre colony was the first colony in 1840. By 1853, more than 50% of the juvenile delinquents were housed in colonies around France. I think by about the year 1870, 80% were. So this became a very popular approach for young petty criminals. And then if we go to the third case study, in Britain, in 1797, Jeremy Bentham wrote an essay entitled Pauper Management Improved, in which he proposed a national scheme of pauper panopticons, and they would house 2,000 people. He said we'd need between 250 and 500 of them, and also the disabled. He explicitly targeted the disabled within these colonies. Built on wasteland, would engage primarily in agrarian labor. And in 2010, there was a folio published of Bentham's where, in fact, and this was books 5 and 6 of Pauper Management Improved, were finally published. And here he actually says explicitly himself that his plan is really to colonize at home. So he says, this is advice I have heard given in print, And he goes on to say to adopt the plan in question would really be to colonize at home. This is immediately after or shortly after the American Revolution, where there was no longer the opportunity to send people overseas. And so the argument was, and he says explicitly, we should not be going to foreign colonies, we should be keeping people at home to work the land at home. And he felt that domestic colonies were better, again, using these ethical and economic justifications. Ethically, rather than eliminating people, we are actually trying to improve them and provide them with housing and support. And economically, it's very draining to defend and run an empire. And so if we just keep these folks at home, we'll make money. And in fact, these colonies, he thought, should be run under a joint stock company. So not the state, but actually a profit-making company that people would invest in. Okay, so the final example I want to talk about is William Booth. He is the leading defender of labor colonies at the end of the 19th century, as I said, the founder of the Salvation Army. In 1890, he published a book in Darkest England, The Way Out. And the title, as he explains right in chapter 1, is explicitly a reference to Henry Stanley's In Darkest Africa. And he literally compares the submerged or the bottom tenth of English poor in the cities of England to the barbarians, as he calls them, of Africa. They both need to be colonized, essentially. Now, if we look at the frontispiece of this book, and that's part of it is actually on my book cover, there's a tripartite colonial scheme that Booth comes up with. And at the very heart of this frontispiece is the farm colony. And this is a colony to which the idle poor, again, vagrants, beggars, etc., were to be sent to be trained in labor, after which they could be sent to become laborers and become economically independent. But if you look at the very bottom of this picture, what you see is the first of the three colonies. That is the city colony, pictured as a lighthouse. And you may not be able to see it that well, but what the bottom is showing is all these figures in the sea of despair, as it were, with like starvation and bedding and gambling and unemployed and all this kind of stuff. And here they are going to be brought into this beacon of hope, which is the city colony. This is all that's really left of the Salvation Army now, are these short-term shelters that people come to for food and for short-term accommodation. But obviously they would go for his idea. Booth's idea was they would be sent to the farm colony to be trained. And then the third colony is over the sea, the colony across the sea. So you could either be sent to the English countryside, which is in the background there, kept at home, or sent overseas. Indeed, 250,000 were sent from Hadley, from the colonies from the colony within England to colonies overseas, according to their figures. And so, again, the colony that was built is this Hadley colony in Essex. So just to conclude, in terms of kind of some key points here that we can kind of draw about domestic colonies. The first is that there were domestic and there were foreign colonies, and the main argument I make in this book is that the same ideology justifies both. The idea of segregating, the idea of engaging in agrarian labor, and the idea of improvement are all important to both domestic and foreign settler colonialists. The second is that in a lot of these domestic colonies, unlike foreign colonies, it's not the state that's running them. It's either civil society organizations or private joint stock companies that are running these. And so it's actually within the private sphere, often religious or philanthropic organizations. And then the final point is just, if we think about domestic colonies, including the colonies of Benevolence in the Netherlands and in Belgium, as nodes along a transnational colonial network across borders. And when I say cross borders, I mean both ideas. That is, people would travel across borders to study one colony and the other, but also bodies. People would be sent from Metre colony to Algiers to become settler colonialists there, as I said, from Hadley to become settler colonialists in other countries. So that's it for me, and I think I'm handing it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. The next speaker will be Dr. Craig Whittle, who actually is an expert on the Salvation Army and also their exploits in India in particular. Craig, the floor is yours.
Right, thanks. Hello, everyone. Mic check. Can you all hear me okay? Lovely, thank you. Right, I'll start with a quick note of thanks to Johan and Barbara and everyone who's been involved in putting together this week of really important events around the 200th anniversary of the Colonies of Benevolence. And as a political theorist, I thought I might spend my time today identifying a few ideas that were in the mix in European social, economic, political thought in the longer 17th and 18th centuries before the colonies that played a role in creating the ideologies that underpin domestic colonialism. But just to talk a little bit about my own work, my historical work, which I'm not going to dwell on too much today, is the so-called criminal tribes system of British India. This was a system that was based on legislation that allowed colonial governments to declare communities, mainly nomadic and semi-nomadic communities, as hereditary criminals, and by doing so, allowing authorities to move individuals connected to those groups into what were called reformatory settlements. Some were originally run by state authorities, but the Salvation Army played an increasingly important role in the early 20th century. Many of those settlements sought to enforce collective cultural change in the people detained there through forced agricultural or industrial labour. That probably raises more questions than it answers, so I'm just going to flag a few books if you wanted to find out more about this system. I'm happy to talk after this event as well. Meena Radhakrishna's Dishonoured by History is a fantastic detailed look at the experiences of the Koravar tribe, and by that you can see the ideologies underpinning both the pre- and post-colonial criminal tribe system. Rachel Tolan has a great essay about the Salvation Army in British India. And Mark Brown has written about what happened to this system after independence. It still carries on having a long and complicated afterlife. So if you're interested, dig away at those or come and see me afterwards, and I'm happy to talk India until, I was going to say till the cows come home, which is an English phrase, but it might be a bit of an unintentional pun in this case. Anyway. The use of the agricultural settlements in India bears close resemblance to the earlier example of unfree colonies of benevolence, such as the settlement at Veenhuizen. Here, individuals from problem social categories, such as unemployed, vagrants, and so on, were sent to work on the land both to make a profit of their cultivation, but also to boost and reform their moral character by engaging in honest agricultural work. For today, I wanted to think about the historical significance of the colonies and what was unique about them, and my answer, my thesis, the thing that hopefully we can talk about afterwards, is that the ideas that inspired their creation were not actually new, but rather that Van den Bosch and the colonies represent the first example of these 5 important threads of European thought from the previous 100 years or so actually coming together and turning into a reality with institutions and techniques that affected the material lives of the people involved. So what are these 5 great ideas? And I haven't come up with any of these myself. I owe a great debt to Barbara and to a lot of other writers. Happy to share my notes afterwards, whichever ones you want to, threads you want to pull on. But we'll start with the idea that land, and importantly productive land, cultivated land, is the key to national wealth. And that it should be the concern of the sovereign or the concern of government to improve the lands that it controls. And this seems to be a bit of a sea change from the earlier understanding of the role of government, which was an emphasis on the control of men, and that was linked to the domestic capacity to warfare. So how many men can you get for your army? How many taxes can you extract to build your ships and your weapons? There seems to be a change around about the 17th century where we start to have the notion of the stewardship of the land as the engine of national wealth, and national wealth as the key to relative international power. So English polymath Francis Bacon, on the left there, is made remarks on this in his essay concerning the greatness of states. He mentioned both the importance of cultivated land and the importance of a cultivated population. He wrote about this very early. I think it was 1623 was the date that the essay was written. But the transition is probably more widely reflected in the success and influence of the so-called physiocrats and Francois Quesnay, who's in the middle there, in the 18th century when they came to a position of preponderance and influence in French political and economic thought. Quesnay wrote on the importance of cultivating land in 1765, and a bit later still, but still before the colonies of Benevolence, was Arthur Young, who's on the right on this picture. He was a British agricultural writer who made the case for the colonization and cultivation of land inside wasteland, inside the United Kingdom's borders, and he did this from 1784. Second big idea that I think is important in a lot of this, thank you, is that I've not actually said the thing yet, so wait until you hear what I say first. Okay, good. Nice. Right. God bless you. Is the idea that the cultivation of land justifies ownership and assumes direct political significance, and this is best expressed in the work of John Locke, who published his second treatise of government in 1689. In that, he makes the argument that it is the infusion of a man's labour into the land, that is cultivating the land rather than just foraging off the top of the land, that gives you title, that justifies your ownership, and it actually worked to justify the dispossession of indigenous lands in North America, which was the context in which he was writing, because he argued the indigenous peoples of North America would scavenge around the land and forage on the land, but they did not actually dig the earth, turn it over, and cultivate crops. So the application of human labour to the land became a critical justification for English colonialism, and that makes the working and cultivation of wastelands an important political element in the thought of the time. Third idea is that agrarian labour that's working out in the country has an inherently moral reformatory character, so that the process of cultivating the land cultivates the person who is doing it. This is not necessarily a new idea. You can find references to it in the Greek poet Hesiod, the Roman poet Virgil, and actually in some elements of Confucian philosophy. But it seems to have made its way into Western political theory through John Locke, who saw it as a religious admonition from God that our purpose on earth is to cultivate the land and make it fruitful. And this was picked up particularly by Thomas Jefferson, writing in 1785 in his notes on the state of Virginia, where he argues, and this is the direct quote, that those who labour in the earth are the chosen people of God. At the same time, Jeremy Bentham, who's the middle picture here, he could have appeared on any one of these 5 slides, and as Barbara has kind of indicated, he is all over the story of domestic colonialism. I will defer to you for any more detailed discussion on Bentham. But he did also begin writing and making arguments for the economic and the moral benefits of domestic colonies. In 1797, he published the Pauper Panopticon, and he also started up a correspondence with Arthur Young about domestic colonies in British agriculture. Fourth idea is that the population exists as an object in itself and is therefore capable of being shaped. This is something that only seems to have entered Western political thought from England again in the 1660s with the work of this cartoon fellow on the left, John Graunt. He had a look at what were called mortality bills, which an example is on the right there. There were a series of lists of what everyone had died from in London over a course of years. And what John Graunt discovered and published on first in 1662 is that although the people concerned are different every time, the population actually had similar percentages every single year for the same things. Similar number of people committed suicide, a similar number of people would get tuberculosis. And as a result of this, the idea in the governing idea of populations was no longer that the population is just a group of individuals, but actually that the population itself has behaviours and characteristics which it can be the point of the state to change. And I think this is where we start to get the kind of population manipulation and shaping that eventually becomes a key element of British and other colonialisms, both at home and abroad. So that was Graunt in 1662, and then this was popularised and expanded by Sir William Petty, who's in the middle there. He published similar analyses for several major European cities between 1682 in 1687. Last but not least in my 5 big ideas is the idea that certain social groups within society are inherently problematic and pose a risk of crime and of rebellion, and therefore need extraordinary intervention in order to make them safe for society. Tropes about the social and criminal risk of so-called masterless men and vagrants are a perennial feature of English political thought from the 16th century. I've taken Robert Cecil here on the left as representative. He passed the Vagabondage Act of 1597, which specified transportation overseas and whipping and various punishments for organized groups of beggars. But actually, there'd already been about 100 years of rather brutal, including maiming and mutilation, punishments for vagrancy in Britain because of the problematic mobility and the danger of crime and rebellion that organized groups of men traveling on the roads seemed to cause. The same point of view can be ascribed to Warren Hastings, who's on the right in this slide. He was the governor of Bengal in 1772 because he was the chief of the East India Company when it became the de facto government. And he passed a legal code in 1772 that included some rather horrific execution ceremonies for gangs who committed collective highway robbery. They were to be taken back to the villages of their birth and have the entire village assembled in front of them while they were hanged, and then their wives and children and surviving family members were to be taken as slaves of the state. The idea was to be so brutal that it wasn't practiced much, so this didn't happen all the time, but I think the extremity shows the danger and the extraordinary level of response that the authorities thought it would require. It strikes me as more than a coincidence that the moral panic surrounding the social dangers of unemployed and other groups that found themselves assigned to the unfree colonies at Veenhuizen occurred in the context of a similarly relatively new Dutch state, as Johan alluded to, and that it was both completing its transition to a new political settlement, but also the rest of Europe was still dealing with some of the shadows of the French Revolution and the idea of what can happen when organized poorer classes in society have had absolutely enough and can overturn entirely established political orders. So these are my 5 ideas. I'm not saying they're the only 5 ideas knocking around at the time, but I think all 5 of them have a real claim to have been influential ideas in fashioning the economic and social changes that led to the Industrial Revolution, that led to Europe's empires around the world, and I think they all played a key role in shaping the world for a good 150 to 200 years. And my thesis, again, is that they had all been in the mix in European literary circles. People have been writing on them, talking about them for 100 to 150 years before Van den Bosch and the Colonies. But the key contribution that the Colonies make to this story is that they combine all of these strands, I think there's a little bit of all of them, into a practice for the first time. And that's what I'm really interested in. When do ideas turn into practices that are imposed on people, and what happens to their lives as a result? In terms of legacies, so then we have the Colonies of Benevolence in 1823. I've brought up here just a random list of similar agricultural reform systems that were either directly inspired or indirectly followed the same disciplinary techniques and ideological underpinnings. They all have their own unique and complicated history, so I'm not seeking to level this out or generalize or reduce one to the other. But I think increasingly, as we all as scholars learn a bit more about each of them, we get to visit sites like we did at Veenhuizen over the last 2 days. The histories of all of these sites are going to benefit from our increased understanding of how they relate to each other, the sites themselves, the people involved, the administrators, but also the people who were subject to these ideas, and the ideas that shaped and sustained the societies that created them. So by consciously examining those ideas and seeing how they take material shape in the past, we also build our capacity to more clearly see and to more critically discuss the ideas, institutions, and historical legacies still shaping our lives today. Thank you.
Great. The third participant in our roundtable is Hanneke Stuit, assistant professor in cultural analysis here at the University of Amsterdam and an expert on carcerality and the countryside. Hanneke, the floor is yours.
It's a scary lady. Thanks, Johan. Hello, everybody. Nice to meet you in this way. Today I'll be looking at, I should say, like, my discipline is a little bit perhaps less historically inclined than my highly esteemed colleagues in this panel. My fields are literature and visual culture, and I will look at some of the visual representations from particularly Frederiksoord, one of the free colonies in the colonies of Benevolence today. What I'll be focusing on is the rural idyll, by which I mean a generally shared and circulated romanticization of the countryside in general, and particularly a romanticization of agricultural labor or agricultural produce in how those colonies were promoted, in this case at the 19th century, in the turn of the 19th century. So what I would like to do is to sort of, I've had a slightly longer version of this presentation in mind, but I will be brief. If there's time, I will return to the ideas of Achille Mbembe, and I'll be eager to discuss this more. But I would like to pick up actually at this idea of, as Craig also mentioned, sort of the idea that agricultural labor is a moral improvement. The performance of agricultural labor is a moral improvement. As I see a legacy that really connects domestic colonization with overseas colonization, sort of the importance of seeing those two together, as Barbara has also argued in her talk today, but also more generally in her book. Right, so there's definitely something that's shared, but I would also like to draw attention to the observation that Barbara has so keenly made, that at the time domestic colonists saw sort of domestic colonization as something to be defended in opposition to overseas colonization, and particularly the punitive sides of that in the penal colony. I think that is a very important difference to make. But I would also like to try and add to this idea to sort of argue that the way agriculture is portrayed in an idyll, like a romanticized version of agricultural labor, actually makes this difference, let's say, palatable to people. So it's very important to see agricultural labor as idyllic, so that the more punitive aspects that are also part of that agricultural labor system become invisibilized in a way. And I referenced to Mbembe earlier because of his emphasis on the sort of, the commonalities between the plantation and the penal colony. But I will return to this if needed. So why this rural idyll, and what exactly is it? I think one of the most comprehensive books on this to date is actually the study by Raymond Williams from 1973. Me and my colleagues have had a lot of difficulty in these last few years of actually adding to his ideas, which are rather comprehensive. But there's like 3 layers, I think, that matter for us today to this book. The first is, as you can see in the title, is that there is a culturally circulated perceived difference between the country and the city, which has a value attached to it. So what happens, according to Williams, and this is something that, as Craig has pointed out, is actually an idea, if the city could be seen as a pre-modern idea, but the idea is actually as old as Hesiod and Virgil, is that sort of civilized settlements should be seen as opposed to the countryside, in the sense that the city is considered modern, progressive, but also morally reprehensible, filthy and noisy. The countryside, on the other hand, is seen as a largely apolitical space that does not really matter for a nation's politics. It is seen as a site that has no real experience of time, and it is a space that is at the same time romanticized quite intensely in order to escape from, let's say, urban turmoil. So there's quite some contradictions going on in this specific distinction that matter to Williams, because, as he argues, these idylls that we have about the countryside, like I said, romanticization of agricultural labor, but also romanticizations of nature itself, are part of that. What is so important about this, according to Williams, is that this hides from view exactly how produce comes to be as it is. It alienates people from the means of production and how production takes place. It alienates people from the actual social relations that constitute the countryside, which is a master and slave dynamic often. And it alienates people from seeing this rural as what is really an extractive hinterland for the city. So the idea that the countryside would exist for a politicized polis and offer its raw material for its sustenance. So that is sort of the idea of the idyll, sort of, let's say, the harm that it does, according to Williams. Now, the third part of this argument pertains particularly to colonization. As Barbara has pointed out quite clearly, colonization itself should be largely seen as, or imagined as, an agricultural endeavor, judging on the Latin etymology there. Right, so what is now this problem, according to Williams, is actually that we do not really manage to escape these city-country oppositions. Instead, what societies do is repeat them perpetually, actually, whereas historical conditions change quite considerably. We still keep repeating the same tropes and ideas, commonplaces about the countryside. And then we actually transport this model overseas. That is sort of the way Williams sees it. So it replicates, according to Williams, colonization or overseas colonization, also to a large extent, replicates domestic city-country dynamics into a larger transnational system, as Barbara has also pointed out, which has ideological roots and also has the material connections through the bodies, of course, right? But there's also, according to Williams, an emotional, affective, imaginative investment in this relationship that is deeply tied to the countryside, to sort of creating peripheral spaces to the urban center. So what I find so crucial about this point, or about his book really, is that he shows with such intense clarity that the peripheralization of both the overseas colonies and then the domestic colonies feed into each other to the detriment of both. Right, so we see, arguably to the detriment of both, I would say, right? So we can see in the case of Van der Bos, Barbara is way more positioned to say more about this, but we can see that in the domestic colonizations, the way in which the countryside is treated is replicated in the colonies, and those detriments are then fed back into a city-country dynamic back home. So it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that the peripheral space is not capable of succeeding. That would be my take on that, conceptually. That is what I take from Williams's book. Now, what does this look like in terms of promotion, I would say? I've brought here a representation of one of the promotion posters for Frederiksoord, a map and some images, as we can see here. It was made here in Amsterdam, actually, around, what was it now? I think 1895, around that time, by Tresling and Co. And it sort of shows a map of these different free colonies. Whereas, as Johan has mentioned early on, there were also 2 unfree colonies. And those were built very, very quickly after the inception of the experiment. The first one in 1819, the Ommerschans, and Veenhuizen, as Johan mentioned, in 1823, which were really prisons within the colony, and people not complying ended up there. What do I find so interesting about this image is that, to me, this is actually quite idyllic looking, right? But of course, we've got the flowers and sort of the soft colors going on, and then we see a lot of the results of the industriousness Frederiksoord was supposed to bring, right, to sort of the coming Dutch nation. Right, so we see its investment in innovation. We see the horse-drawn tram. We see investments in education, 3 agricultural schools, forestry, agriculture, horticulture. We see 3 farms, actually, pointing to the agricultural core of the business there. And what's quite interesting is that it has really a kind of villagey feel. right? It's almost like a postcard. This one is actually from the 1980s that I also found in the images available from the Society of Benevolence. So it's like, please do come visit us, do take instruction, and come see how we're doing. Right, so now interestingly, I think one of those 3 farms really points to what was going on in these experimentation colonies from the start in 1818, Frederiksoord, and that's this one. My eye was drawn onto it originally because it is so weirdly tilted. I'm not sure how to interpret this. Like, I have no, like, it could be subliminal, or like, I don't know why. There seems to be no clear visual reason, to me at least, why this should be the case. It's really quite odd, which is why it drew my attention. And I recognized the picture from going through the archive before. And here we see the family farm. Johan earlier showed a map with all sort of small-scale farms in a row. That was sort of the basic structure of Frederiksoord, where families were placed on a farm like this in order to, well, 4 or 5 days a week work in the communal fields or in the factories that were also present in these colonies, and then 1 or 2 days a week to work their own plot of land, which was, I think, close to a hectare, if I'm right, and it was supposed to be tilled by the family itself. Then the proceeds from these little fields were also going to releasing the debt that was part of occupying farms like this. So you didn't get the farm for free. You would have to pay off your debts for the clothes, for the inventory, also for the sowing crops, and occasionally for like a sheep or a cow if it was part of your farm in particular. What struck me about this image is that it is really, it looks quite easy to read, but the more I look at it, the more inscrutable it becomes to me, particularly the people in it, right? I would argue that actually, like this picture, where we see the proceeds of industriousness, but no people depicted at all, this small-scale farm actually shows an idea of agricultural labor rather than that labor itself. It shows the idea of the so-called ideal little family farm rather than really how that farm was worked. Like I said, I think the man in the middle, I find that, like, it's inappropriate to laugh, of course, but I also find it in a way quite, like, it has to do with the medium of photography at the time, where things are quite static as they are photographed, but this man is not really standing near any field that needs to be tilled or soil that needs to be turned. Sort of the lady to his right is in the back. She has clearly no real role that is also related to the field. The role is associated with the house, right? She is the only one smiling if you look really, really closely. But then again, I also find that really uncanny as kind of a token that everything is as it should be in this little family idyll. And then the mysterious gentleman on the left, who is quite difficult to place. We could say, is he a son? Is he another hand? Is he a work hand? What is he doing in that foliage? So there's all sorts of questions that could be asked about also how these 3 people are positioned. But I think for me, the conclusion would be that these people really serve as props in sort of a staged family idyll related to the farm. Right, though, as we now know, also because of the comments of my esteemed earlier speakers, and for those of you who are interested, not only is there a fascinating book on Johannes van den Bosch himself, the author is sitting there, but also there is an interesting series by Will Schachman on various aspects of the colonies of benevolence, and in this particular version, Mr. Schachman has argued for looking also at the free colonies as a kind of penal system. So sort of he is explaining how it seems the further away people would get from this idyllic rendition of Frederiksoord and the little farms, the closer they would get to a carceral consequence of their behavior. So either being fined, there was like a whole independent punitive system that was not the same as Dutch law, but it had its own spoken and unspoken laws within the colonies that people were subject to. So any kind of lucid behavior, lewd behavior, I should say, sorry, drunkenness or immorality was highly severely punished, and with repeated infraction, one would be removed to the penal colonies, either the Ommerschans or Veenhuizen, or removed from the colony altogether to yet a different peripheral colony. What's the name again, Anjali?
Which one?
The place where they were sent to, like if you were kicked out of Frederiksoord. No, but there was like a village where.
Themselves, you mean?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. With the shacks. What's it called again?
Yes.
In any case. Right, so one would move from like increasingly, let's say increasingly penalized, and if that failed, then further peripheralized spaces on the Drenthe peat bogs and heath, where you would live in shacks with other people who had similarly failed this idyll. Right, so this is, I think, a fascinating way in which you can sort of see how in the presentation of these colonies it's very important. I would like to draw your attention to this slide here on the right. It's very important that people are seen as an idea or as a group that could labor, but they don't actually labor all that much. There's a lot of posing, there's a lot of reliance on ordered and idyllic presentation. Maybe, as we were talking, I was thinking this might very well have to do with this idea of title and land. Because if people are seen to labor the land, don't they have a right to it? Right, so it's very important that to see at the idyll like which person is seen to labor in which way, and this sort of leads me to conclude that the idyllic and the carceral exist actually on a continuum, and that they sort of keep each other alive a little bit. I think I'll leave it for now. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks to all of you for your for your presentations. We would like to open the floor for questions. There was a lot of information, a lot of different perspectives from which we've started exploring the ideas and the ideologies behind these Dutch colonies of benevolence, so to say. We can take it any way you want. Who would like to start by asking your first question, please? The gentleman there.
Wait, I'll bring you a mic. Oh, thank you. Can I? Yeah, great, lovely, thanks. I'm sorry. What was your name again? With the last. Halaga. Yes, thank you so much. A lovely presentation from everybody. And just a quick question on the pictures you were showing. Who do you think the intended audience was of that? And would you think of that as propaganda?
Yes. No, I would. Thanks for the question. I would. I think there is. I think it is propaganda because I see it as propaganda because of the society that was behind it, right? So it was a let's say a maatschappij, and people could offer their money for charity, and then sort of to have that invested in the colonies, hopefully in the future with a return profit. But it started out as a charitable enterprise. So I think in this case, and in that, for my argument, maybe that should be flagged, right? That they really do need this idyll in this particular case in order to keep people investing in the colonies, and to make sure that that some sort of funds kept coming from the cities, and that the subcommittees who were located there would select like the right families in order to fit sort of the ideas of who was sent down there, because there were sort of committees in most large cities in the Netherlands who sent down their most destitute, but then I guess also most suitable families to the colonies. So it's in this case quite a persistent. I think there is some argumentation in the imagery, although it is difficult to really gauge the full intent behind it, but I would tend to say so, yes. Thanks.
Please, the woman up front.
Up front, yeah.
Thank you for the presentations. I've got a strange idea came on. Is the kolkhoz in Russia based on the same philosophy, I thought? Because it was also some kind of people coming together, agriculture, development, and so.
What was the reference?
The kolkhoz in Russia after the revolution, is that based on the same idea, or is it completely different, only economic reasons, or it pops up?
Do you want to reply, Barbara? Craig?
I don't know enough about the Russian example, so I couldn't comment.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, with my studies of the criminal tribe system, I think that is a much closer point of comparison. I think the compulsion is more, the violence, implicit and explicit in the system is more. The extent to which labour exploitation is an important part of it. I think the way I would answer the question personally is I would say the colonies of benevolence have practices and institutions that inspired others, but that it's the others that went on their own historical journeys, like the criminal tribes, often ones in more coercive colonial places where you can get away with doing more things to people, that probably stand in the line of development that leads us through to systems like that. Whereas I don't think I would, it's an indirect inheritance, I say, because you need different ideas to combine with it before you can end up at that system. But the criminal tribe system, I think, legitimately requires a place in the story of how we came to have mass detention in institutions exempt from legal oversight, which turned into black holes for political dissidents and which ended up being based on the exploitation and extraction of forced labor.
Would you also like to say something perhaps about the different ways, different political appropriations of the idea of the agrarian colony, Barbara, given that it's one of your theses in your book?
Yeah, I get the way I often express the idea of a colony is that you can think about it on a very wide normative spectrum that goes from, say, a penal colony with hard labor, or I would also argue settler colonies where, indigenous peoples were exterminated or dispossessed of their land. That's a profoundly negative form of colonies. Right through to, on the other end, artists or writers' colonies, which are these sort of, kind of idyllic places to go, and then everything in between. And I would see the agricultural colonies, the ones that I'm talking about, the domestic colonies in the middle of that spectrum, but that can have aspects of carcerality, can have aspects of utopianism. One of the examples I use in the book actually is the Doukhobor colonies in Saskatchewan, Canada, financed by Leo Tolstoy and Peter Kropotkin, leading anarchist thinkers in the world. Yet they're also thinking about these utopian colonies that are going to be sites of radically changing the world, overthrowing the state, getting rid of capitalism, getting rid of militarism. So there's a huge variety, normative varieties of ideologies that can match up to colonialism and colonies. Why am I using this? Sorry. Somebody handed it to me, so I used it.
There's a question in the back. You guys should use it.
Thank you very much. I really liked each of your stories, and I learned a lot of that. So you told us extensively on the philosophy behind the creation of the domestic colonies and how they developed in the different countries. My question is, we didn't hear anything about the aftermath. Mm-hmm. So the determinants of why these domestic colonies cease to exist. So could you tell us a little bit more about that, and if the determinants of the disappearance of the domestic colonies were similar in the various countries?
Great question. Well, you may have something to say about this too, Craig, but so one of the things that's really striking to me about all of the colonies that I studied and I wrote about was actually generally how quickly they failed. I mean, some lasted very little time. Often they'd last as long as the central individual philanthropist. In the case of Mettray, that's de Metz. In the case of the Salvation Army, that's Booth, that they would start to collapse as soon as the central figure that was trying to bring it into existence was no longer with us. But there are larger structural issues as well. They went bankrupt. I mean, if you go up, I mean, the Wilhelm I was secretly financing some of these things when they just ran out of money and those pamphlets were not working anymore. But I think one of the reasons why people study places like Mettray and the colonies of benevolence is because they lasted actually much longer than most did. And in the end, I think it was probably that the economic model they thought was going to work did not work. It was not, they thought it was going to produce money, that these colonists in the free colonies would pay off their debts. Well, they didn't, or a lot of them didn't. And it just kept getting, what you see is kind of a pattern of utopian thinkers who create these colonies thinking this is going to be some great thing, and they become more and more warehouses. And if you look at the colony in Veenhuizen, later they're building these large structures for beggars and vagrants, and they just push more and more people. They become more carceral, and then they just collapse. So I think there's some similarities, and I mean, there's so many of them it would be hard to say, sort of make the comparison between all of them. But I think there's some general factors there that I've described.
Yeah, I can talk a bit about the end of the criminal tribe system. It did have a bit of longevity, so from the original Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, it lasted all the way until just after independence, so about 81, 82 years in total. Obviously, post-independence, it was politically untenable in a lot of the Indian nationalist and Indian Congress movements from the 30s onwards. The criminal tribe system became one of their major outrages that they would quite rightly use to argue against or argue for Indian independence. There's an interesting story in the Mark Brown essay that I put on the slide there, Post-Colonial Penality, about the strange afterlife of this system. These groups, despite being denotified of their criminal status after independence, they're now known as denotified tribes. They are still some of the most precarious and stigmatized and marginalized communities in the country. So after independence, the settlement system came apart. So the other thing to note here is that there were two bits of the criminal tribes. One was the label, and then one was the people actually moved into the settlement. So the label was applied to around about 13 million people overall, but only 3.5 million of those were subject to some form of detention, forced labor, or detention in settlements. Even more bizarrely, I saw a news story a year or two ago, which was about a denotified tribe trying to sue to gain private ownership of the place in which they were forcibly settled, because they are still at real risk of violence from settled communities, which is part of the wider anti-nomadism stuff that is a universal human prejudice, it seems. And that gave me a bit of a quandary, because I was thinking about the system designers, and I was thinking, actually, I'm sure quite a lot of them would be really happy to think that this tribe were now petitioning a legally constituted court to gain private ownership over a plot of land. I don't know. It's an interesting question to think through. I don't know if that case is resolved yet. But yes, as soon as independence happened, it became politically untenable to have the settlements. A few years after they came apart, though, there was a Habitual Offenders Act, which was passed, and by a bizarre coincidence started targeting many individuals from the same communities with a different set of juridical sanctions on the basis that they still had an association with criminal activity. So the prejudice didn't go away, but the settlements couldn't survive independence. Hope that's useful.
Yeah, if I may, I think maybe for the specific case of Veenhuizen, maybe not so much. I don't know as much about the other. I know some about stuff about Frederikswoord and mostly Veenhuizen. What I found so compelling about that history is that it's actually quite a gradual phasing out, and that is, I think, relevant sort of for the way we think about it today still. So it's never been truly ended in the sense that first it was sold to.
Still a prisoner.
It's still a prison and an arsenal for the Dutch military, right? So and then there was also a lot of refugees housed there in the 2015 crisis. During the Second World War, there was a lot of people there, right? So it has sort of changed, but I think that sort of trajectory started when it was handed over or sold to the government. I believe it was in 1859, but I'm always looking at Angélie for the date, so I'm not necessarily an insecure person, but when it comes to dates, I always go to Angélie. And then not long after that, the Dutch government moved it to its Ministry of Justice, right? So where it sort of started off as a charitable, potentially fundraising enterprise, in its history, it also, in a legal sense, became increasingly carceral until it was, I think at one point there were 3 or 4 operating prisons there. Now there is, I think, only the one, Essenheim. But it's been, for a long time, it's been also a place where Dutch prison guards were trained, and currently it houses the National Prison Museum, which sort of tells the history of Dutch prisons, right? So it's, in terms of legacy, I think, which is not to say that I think it only has that it has only a carceral legacy, but I think in the particular case of Veenhuizen, it is quite important to acknowledge the trajectory that it did take, and that is a trajectory that we don't talk about a lot. How sort of these colonial, let's say the failure of a colonial experiment very quickly turns into a punitive system, and how that then is fed into modern ideas about punishment, etc. So there's definitely an afterlife, as Craig so elegantly put it there. I'd say. But thanks for that's a really great question. Thank you.
Anyone else? Please.
Thank you. This is just endlessly fascinating. I'm wondering if there is anything interesting to say about resistance in the domestic colony system, and in particular about organized resistance, because it sounds like there was, I don't know, there was disobedience. Obviously, people could be penalized and moved to increasingly worse places to live. You could think of that as resistance, but were there the versions of like prison riots, or did people ever get together and say, like, this is terrible, we're going to try to take some of the power back?
There's a couple people that were at our symposium in Veenhuizen that could speak to this in much more detail, but including Stephen Toth, who has written on Mettray Colony a whole book, and he actually has gone through the archives very carefully and discovered all of the ways that people resisted, but it tended to be small acts of resistance. And they would violate rules. They would deliberately violate them. They would swear at the guards. They would come, but they would do it over and over and over again. There was also a poster from one of our graduate students, and looking specifically at women. And I rode with her on the bus and was just chatting with her about it. And what she also went through I said, how did you find out like these? And it's all about the records they kept of the violations that individual people had done. And that's where she got all of this. And she said sometimes it would be a short little sentence, sometimes it would be paragraphs about what this person is doing. And she said you can read into it you know, and often there was also sexual activity that was used as resistance for both of them, for both Stephen Toth and this other, hers was in Veenhuizen. So I think less kind of organized activity because they're watched all the time. I mean, you know, you've got this deliberate architecture of watching. So if people were going to gather together, I think it would be stopped pretty quickly. But certainly in all these ways, I think there was. I don't know if anybody else.
Thank you. There are some, in the criminal tribe system, there are disciplinary records that show that occasionally there are bits of misbehavior. I've not seen anything as full scale as a riot. There have been some records that say that a group of men would storm out of the settlements when they were less well walled and guarded, when they were more like kind of places that you, radiuses that you couldn't get beyond. So sometimes there were stories of people who would abscond and then be picked up and come back. I mean, one interesting thing is the way that the earlier part of the system exploited some caste-based fears about traveling over water to threaten people with deportation to the Andaman Islands if they continued to misbehave, and that had a really powerful effect on groups for whom traveling over water was taboo. So there are tantalizing glimpses, but then I guess I'm reading the British government's records and the Salvation Army records, and any story that doesn't end with them successfully convincing the tribespeople to come back and work usually doesn't feature in that archive. I think Primbayada Gopal did a book called Insurgent Empire, which tries to capture some of the stories of rebellion and resistance in the wider British colonial system. That's definitely worthy of a read, and there must be a lot more on the kind of grassroots day-to-day resistance, a bit like you were mentioning, but not much that I've found captured in the archive beyond misbehaviour, punishment, and reform.
I don't have significant historical data to add to this conversation, but I did want to say a little bit about Will Schachman's book, the Strafkolonie book, because he writes it beautifully, and it's very neutral, I think. It's the way he writes it down, but one can taste. In some of the chapters, I think Will's perhaps desire or observation that the colonies did not succeed because of all these little acts of resistance. Right? So that in the end, sort of that this utopic idea did not come to fruition because people kept getting drunk, and people did not want to be disciplined, and they did not want to be laboring, and they didn't. Right. So there's. I don't mean to read too much into his archival work that he's done, but I appreciated this a great deal actually in his book, where to me he was sort of implying like, yeah, there's only so much domestication any person can take, and. And then things start to crumble. So that was sort of the individual human side of it in that book is quite compelling.
Perhaps one of you would also like to say a little bit more about the forms of surveillance, the forms of monitoring and control that were institutionalized within these domestic colonies precisely as a way to reform and to morally improve the inhabitants of these colonies. The ways in which this perhaps was indeed, as you suggested, linked up to or enabled forms of resistance, or just the minutiae of these forms of monitoring.
I mean, the most obvious is Jeremy Bentham, because his name is associated with panopticism. And, you know, I mean, Foucault, of course, this is who he uses as his quintessential example of, and people now, if you pick up any paper where they're talking about surveillance, you will hear panopticon or you will hear Bentham's name. So, and he certainly felt that there needed to be an architectural form to the panopticon in both prison as well as pauper panopticons, through which the staff could be watching the inmates. But I think And I will say also at Veenhuizen, they had these forms of surveillance as well, close monitoring. But I'll say this about Bentham that has been, that I think Foucault got wrong, which was he was also concerned with abuse of the staff towards the inmates, particularly female inmates and children. And so he felt surveillance would go both ways. That in fact, you make it open, you make it everybody observable to everybody, and there's a form of disciplinary power, absolutely there, but there's also a discipline on the staff not to abuse, because other staff are watching them as well as other the people that are living there. So, so that's what I would say. I think in Mettray, there was a little bit less of that. It wasn't structured that way. They had separate houses, and they were run as families, with a father and an older brother. They were male, all male, the colonies. And so there would be that sort, but not the same kind of surveillance that you see in the Dutch version or the British version of the story.
Do you have time?
Just briefly.
Yeah, briefly. Can you please show the picture of Veenhuizen?
The idyllic one or the...
Yes, the idyllic one. That'll be fun.
Good.
For the contrast.
Go for it.
Right, so I think what's interesting about this is we see the inside of the building here. There were 3 buildings of this nature in Veenhuizen as a village. And I think what is quite unique about... well, maybe it's unique about domestic colonization in general, but what I know about Veenhuizen is that's unique is that prison guards and inmates or colonists, in a sense, lived together very closely. So on the inside were the inmates, or the orphans, or the vagrants, depending on which phase in history and who was there. And then in the outside ring of the building, there would be some of the wardens would live with their families, and they would watch sort of the inside of the building, right? So it was all very sort of cheek by jowl, or very close together. And in Frederiksoord, it was more a situation where I think there was sort of a medal system where people would be rewarded. And then if you risen enough in the rank, you could actually become like a watch person in the system yourself. And then you would sort of graduate towards a more surveillance state while still living in the same village. So it was very entangled. I'm not sure if there's a conclusion there, but I think it does matter to mention it.
Can I just add one more thing, which is I actually think in colonialism writ large, that idea of living close and shaping people from within was absolutely, the idea of improvement was improving from within. And so even if you think about what the residential school systems for Indigenous children in Canada, the same idea that you're actually living very close, you really need to be nearby to monitor, to ensure people are changing on an hourly, daily, weekly basis.
There's a question in the back.
Actually, in terms of the people improving themselves, I was wondering, you mentioned wardens being present in the colonies of benevolence, but I was wondering if something like pastoral care, or nowadays you'd call social workers, or those types of functions were available.
Yeah, I mean, probably you can speak about the colonies of benevolence. One thing that we haven't talked about, but was very important to all of these colonies, was religion. So, they were often, the Mettray was run by a Catholic association and explicitly Catholic. And same with, obviously the colonies of benevolence, William Booth, the Salvation Army in its name is suggested the kind of, so there was always this pastoral care in this kind of religious sense. Was certainly there, and I think that's the way they would think about social workers, as more through the God and through the religious sort of instruction. Yep.
Yeah, I think maybe just an interesting addition is I think there was a Catholic church, a Protestant church, and a synagogue.
In Veenhuizen.
In Veenhuizen, yeah.
There's a question.
And they're buried separately too.
The curious thing of the colonies of benevolence is exactly that they didn't do religion as such, but they had a kind of religion light.
Right. And people could freely follow their own religion too.
Yes.
Yes.
And education was much more important than pure religion or looking up to God and thanking Him or whatever He was called for everything they got. So I think that's also the atypical influence of Johannes van den Bos on this particular point. Yeah.
That's a good point.
Let me just jump in really quick on the Salvation Army in India. Because first of all, there was resistance from the UK government to any religious organisation initially getting involved in this kind of work. There was a fear that Christian proselytization would lead to more rebellions like the one that they faced in 1857. And so there was no real conversion focus actually in the settlements. They were really, really happy in their diaries whenever someone had actually decided to accept Jesus and become a member of the Salvation Army. And these were not by no means a majority of the people. There were regular prayer drills where you had to come at a certain time of day and kneel down while the prayer happened, but that was more about regulating people's time. So although it was always there, and I'm sure it was strongly encouraged, the line was that there was no attempt to proselytize.
I actually think it's not about proselytization. I think it's about pastoral care. So I think it's always present. Yeah. But I do think, I mean, it's quite striking in Veenhuizen. You go from the synagogue to the Protestant church, they're literally right beside each other. And so it really is an indication of a kind of religious pluralism that you do not see in other colonies.
Well, I really like the discussion. And so I learned again a lot of the science behind your studies, but I want to ask you something more personally, because you have devoted much time and energy in getting to the history of the domestic colonies and about all the people who were developing that. But were you not a little bit attracted personally to those ideas and to maybe not only romance, but just the philosophy? Because I think these were great people who really cared about their fellow citizens. So that is my first question. And if you answer this in the positive, and I hope so,
not to direct the witness.
Are you not disappointed that nowadays we lack these people?
Yeah.
And then, coming from that particular second question, of course it follows my final question. Do you see any role for kinds of domestic colonies in a modified form in our current legal and penal system?
Well, thanks for that question. Again, it's a great question. So what I would say is, I mean, the thing that's so fascinating for me about these various colony schemes is just that you have to hold the good and the bad simultaneously. You know, in the sense that I think you're right that a lot of these thinkers were trying to respond to what they saw as the lives of misery around them. And what do we do about it? We can't leave this. The same way as people look out and see homeless folks and say, you know, in my city of Vancouver, there's homeless people that, you know, it's just, well, how do we solve this problem? So yeah, I can see absolutely why there is a vision there, why there is a sense of trying to help people and to create these colonies. But simultaneously, and I'll just add to that there's also examples of colonies I talk about in the book, like freedom colonies built by and for African Americans that were about creating spaces of freedom and equality. So I think you cannot collapse the story into either a positive or a negative story. The two must be held simultaneously. What worries me about So, and then if we go further into contemporary, there are examples of this. Horticultural therapy is a form of sort of farming in order to help people get, improve. But what I would say is a couple of things about this. The first is, I worry very much about the first principle I talked about, segregation. I think when you segregate populations and remove them from any oversight, almost always abuse follows. Partly because the idea of improving from within sort of removes the boundaries around people, and partly because anybody who wishes to abuse vulnerable populations, and these are always the most vulnerable populations, have the impunity to do so because they know they won't get caught. So we see in many of these places that one of the largest civil cases in Canada was around the provincial farm colony in Ontario and the survivors of that colony, how much sexual and physical abuse went on. On the other hand, if you ask me, should we be looking at this now? Again, what's interesting in British Columbia, my own home province, they are reopening what was the original provincial farm colony, not as a farm colony, but as they've renovated it. But because what they're finding is that the deinstitutionalized movement was to shut down these kinds of projects, has led without appropriate supports and housing to people ending up on the street with mental health, substance abuse issues, and so on. So there is a kind of reversal going on now. And all I would say is that as we think about how we care for and treat people that often have very complicated compounding problems in their lives, how do we do it in a way that that we allow freedom, that we allow also, that we avoid the problems of the past where segregation often led to abuse. So it's not an easy, simple answer for me. There are for some. I mean, the disability community will argue deinstitutionalization, mainstreaming, period. But I think there are populations where that has led to some very serious problems that we've seen, especially, I don't know so much about Europe, but in North American cities. Lots of people on the street with some very serious problems.
I would like to, we're nearing the end of our roundtable, but I would like to return to the question we start with, namely, what do we also see once we start thinking about these domestic colonies, such as the Dutch colonies of Benevolence? What do we see? What kind of interpretive possibilities opened up when we take them seriously by their own description as colonies? And I would like to, in closing, put this to, in the first instance, to Barbara. How does the study of these colonies, not just as in their material reality as a colony, right, as you pointed out, this agrarian place, but also that the ideology behind it you showed is one that is in common between, it's a colonizing, a colonialist ideology. What does this, how should we rethink, should we rethink the idea of colonialism, the relationship between colonialism and imperialism, the relationship between overseas colonies, foreign colonies, as well as domestic colonies? How do you, what kind of theoretical framework would you, do you think your research arrives at?
In a minute or less, right?
Yeah, you have 30 seconds. No, go
yeah, there we go. Well, what I would say is, I think part of the reason I wrote this book is because I think we've forgotten this history. I think when you talk about colonization now, if you ask most people, they would think domination, and for good reason, right? If you think about imperial colonies or imperial colonization, it's a story of racial domination by and large, and also class and economic exploitation and extraction. But what I would say in terms of the relationship between colonialism and imperialism is that imperialism is an ideology that was about domination from afar by a metropolis, and colonialism always had this agrarian thread, or almost always had an agrarian thread, and it was about people living amongst and with the people that they were colonizing. And often that had real seriously negative repercussions, actually. But I think that the way that we can think about the foreign and the domestic colonies is through this ideology that justified them, that characterized by these three principles as I lay them out at the beginning. And I think that helps us to recover the history that's been lost through post-colonial studies, as important as those have been, but also allows us to put them in the same frame and understand this kind of spectrum that we're talking about. And the final thing I would say is it helps us to understand why, currently, quite rightly, most of us reject the idea of colonialism as an ideology, and yet 100 years ago, the leading reformers and progressive thinkers in the world embraced it. So we need to understand why that is, and are there different ways we can think about it historically that might lead us to understand why progressives and reformers would embrace it.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you very much, Craig. And thank you very much, Hanneke. Please join me in thanking them. And thanks to all of you for being present. And as a way of also conveying our own gratitude, there will now be drinks freely available to you in the corner. Thank you so much. And also thank to the people watching us from afar.